Good morning, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Business Management 325. So, in this week, we're going to delve into two very deep and overarching topics: culture and, in a sense, related ethics. So, a few things. First of all, great job on the first round of presentations. Thanks to those groups for setting a high bar. So these are both topics which I have a distinct interest in and have spent a lot of time on. So let's start with culture. Culture, as Hofstede said, who I think is one of the best theorists in terms of having a quantitative approach to culture, which is challenging, is the cumulative operating system for group behavior. I think that's a good way to think about it. And group is the key here. Uh, you arguably cannot have a culture of one or even two. It's sort of when you're starting to get into larger groups. Culture has many, many inputs, and country is just one way to think about it. You have education, you have religion, you have the political economy, you have your family, you have your philosophical values, you have external environment. There are many, many things that come into culture. Another thing I'd like to think about is that there are many, many ways to split it besides just country, right? And sociologists like to split the U.S. into multiple cultures. You can not just regional. I actually did this in an econometrics paper, so I split it sort of roughly by geography. But another way is to look at what sort of American English do people speak? What is the prevailing religious ethical belief in the area? There's lots of ways to think about it. And then within each culture, you have a subculture. One way to think about Boise State is we're in US culture, and then Pacific Northwest, and then Mountain West, and then Idaho, and then Boise, and then Boise State, and then Kobe, and then the Department of Management, and then Business Management 325. And in that, we can even split it down further. People who like orange soda versus people who like Sprite. Okay, so there's lots of ways to split it as long as you have significant groups. And I think the internet is having a profound impact on definitions of culture because I spend a lot of time on Facebook groups with my hobbies in particular, with a lot of outdoor stuff. And you're starting to see all these groupings through social media, which have absolutely no relation to geography. I find that to be something that's changing the world. So you can have groups which are not as linked by geography as in the past. And then Hofstede, as I've already mentioned, I think is one of the best theorists. We did a paper comparing the way that US mid level managers think of and perceive commonly used management terms compared to their Chinese counterparts in the mainland China. And we found some significant similarities and differences. And Hofstede is one of the ways that we use to explore this. And as I like to say, Hofstede is not a silver bullet. And unfortunately, most of the research, it's the one good thing about Hofstede is the research goes back to the late 70s. So you have a long sample to compare with, but it's primarily focused on countries rather than on some of these subcultures. But it does give you a good litmus test, especially if you're trying to get a feel for a country that you're not familiar with, be it Belize or Beirut or Bangladesh or wherever. So it's you can just look up on the internet. It's a good idea to give you some basic guidelines. But of course, Hofstede does all of his research based on large scale surveys. So what you're looking at is a mean, right, on a bell curve, right? So obviously there's plenty of outliers. I was having a discussion about this yesterday with a South African friend who said, Americans, I think of Americans being very individualistic, which is true in Hofstede, but that doesn't mean that all Americans are extremely individualistic. It means that uh, that's the mean of a population sample. Whereas with China, for example, you would see people being more collective. And the final thing I want to say is there's a lot of research that's been done and a lot of chatter in the C suites around firms showing that culture is a really key determinant of long term performance and success. And some of the real knockout firms, Google, Tesla, Facebook, as well as aeronautics firms, engineering firms, find that culture is sort of, along with having leading technology, culture is key because if you have a good culture, and this is something that I also do a lot of research on, you're likely to attract better people and retain them. So it's a real key determinant of talent. If you don't like the culture in a place, if you don't fit in, or you don't feel like you really believe in what they're doing, then you're not likely to stay. You're probably looking for something else. And that leads us to the next big topic for this week, ethics, right? So ethics is I don't like to think of it as right and wrong because that's sort of one definition. Ethics is really what you feel is the behavior that you should follow in your heart, maybe is the best way to define it. And one thing I like to start off, so when I was an undergraduate, I was a double major in philosophy, and I did a lot of work with ethical philosophy, studying Kant and on the metaphysics of morals. It's a 750-page treatise on this. If you're interested, I won't put that on the required reading list. But one thing I think is really important is to distinguish between ethics and compliance. So in the business world, especially since 2000, and I named that year because that marked the decline, the implosion of Enron, WorldCom, and a number of other firms which sort of followed the burst of the dot-com bubble. And you saw the emergence in the US of this CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, which is a great thing. But what's the difference between being ethical and being compliant? So I would define as ethics as the first definition is doing what you feel is right in your heart, whereas compliance means making sure that you follow the letter of the law. And these two things can be quite different, I think, in many cases. So you have to really think about, is your behavior compliant, which is important, obviously, because if it's not, you generally tend to get in trouble, fines, or worse. Um, I'll use this as an example of the book mentions the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a U.S. legislation that is duly enforced by the Department of Justice, which means criminal penalties, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission, which means commercial penalties. So if you've watched Billions, it's a great show about hedge fund guys versus the DOJ, sort of gets into this sort of dilemma. But that's something that came out of Idaho, came out of Senator Frank Church. But this is requires compliance rules across nations. But you really have to think about, are you happy with your decision ethically, right? And do you want to? It has a lot to do, I think, with which firms you'll work with, what decisions that you will make, and then getting into the philosophy of it, which we won't spend too much time on. I think that in ethics, both in the West and elsewhere, you have these two major threads. One is a sort of legalist view, which is more the compliance. It says we have to make rules and enforce them, and people will follow them. And the other is what I like to think of as a more Confucian view, which comes out of China, but you see this quite a bit in a lot of Western philosophers, from Hume to Nietzsche to others, which basically says that it's more of an ethical view, right? You should decide what you should do for yourself, and you see this battle, I think, throughout countries, throughout civilizations, about which one's on top, and different systems tend to be in charge at different times, right? So I mentioned China's being Confucian, but you can argue that Xi Jinping, as a very authoritarian figure in China, has turned the pendulum back to legalists, which China also has a tradition of, by the way, as with other cultures. And then with ethics, and compliance, there's global differences, right? Different countries have different histories, different cultures, which lead to different decisions about what's right and wrong. So one of the examples I love to use in class is a bribe, right? What's a bribe, right? If you try to send me a text message saying that you'll wash my car if I give you extra credit, I think probably most people would consider that to ethically be a bribe. And I'm sure Boise State, in terms of compliance, would not be happy with that. But on the other hand, What about a tip, right? So tipping is a an expected practice in the U.S., but in many other countries, it's considered a bribe, right? So there's definitely some. That's just a simple example, right? But there's definitely differences from country to country. And then finally, what I would like to add to this is, which I think has gotten wrapped into ethics in the book to an extent, but it's this idea of sustainability. And Boise State, as a university, is really looking at sustainability, and I think this is really critical because a lot of what we're talking about, in current events, for example, is about these sort of solving these problems right now, which are between firms or between countries. There's this whole long-term view, things like global warming, things like disease control, things like poverty. These are things which I think have a very, very long term impact. So, to get into a sustainability issue, which ties into ethics. So, there's been a debate recently about COVID having not just unduly impacted smaller firms, but also unduly impacted people with less resources, right? Families and kids who have less money and less access to internet and broadband have tended to do poorer and fall further behind, whereas those who are already well off have tended to do well. And you see this in the U.S., but it's also a big debate in China and elsewhere, which of course I follow. And I think of a story I read yesterday about Ketchum, right? The mayor suggested that the rents are going up too high, so teachers and nurses and service people across serving Sun Valley are unable to afford rent. So it suggested having a tent city, right? It's sort of, I think it was a tongue-in-cheek remark, but this sort of shows how these perceptions of ethics around economics can lead to political issues and potential instability. So these are really, really complex issues. Unfortunately, we're only talking about it for a week in this class. I go into this in much greater detail, particularly in my international management class, which I teach every semester. But I urge you to spend some time on this and think about it and continue to think about it beyond the class. So thanks and look forward to all of your work as well as the presentations.